From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan. When Joe Biden began his four-year term last January, his approval rating was 56%. Now, a year later, it has fallen to 42%. It's been a tumultuous year for Joe Biden, to say the least, with much of his agenda still stalled in the U.S. Congress. Unemployment rates in the U.S. fell to less than 4% by the end of 2021, while jobless claims fell to a 50-year low. Those are all good news. But a political battle is raging over voting rights as Republicans are keen on pushing restrictions. What makes a seemingly genuine and engaging man one of the most unpopular presidents in modern American history? Now, as someone who covered the White House for 6 years in Washington, D.C., here are my 2 cents. Joe Biden ended his first year in office as the most unpopular U.S. president in modern history, only with the exception of Donald Trump. Wow, who could have thought? I mean, I covered the White House in Washington for 6 years when Joe Biden was vice president, and to be honest with you, he struck me as a genuine, engaging, and likable man. But reality has shown us once again that the U.S. presidency is at the mercy of events. He campaigned mainly on 3 things: to bring COVID under control, to bridge America's divide, and to boost America's standing around the world. Now, Joe Biden tried on all 3. He tried pretty hard, but in many instances, he had limited success. And on a few occasions, he even failed badly. Starting with COVID. If you look at the polls, Joe Biden's popularity fell sharply around the late July period when the Delta variant swept across America. In fact, July the 27th was the very day when the average of cases reached over 60,000. Now, with Omicron bringing daily case count to over 1 million in December, approval ratings dropped further. Expectation matters. A year ago, Joe Biden played up the expectation that he would be the president defeating COVID, and apparently he could not. Whenever a president disappoints expectations, there is a problem, said Brookings scholar and former advisor to U.S. President Bill Clinton, Bill Galston. Now, another deep drop in Biden's approval ratings happened around late August after the U.S.'s chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, during which 13 service members were killed. Though most Americans favored withdrawing from Afghanistan, but in the era of social media and 24/7 news cycle, optics is everything. It is more about the perception of things than how things actually are. The desperate scenes from Kabul airport as the Taliban took control undermined the perceptions of Joe Biden as a seasoned foreign policy expert who promised to restore America's standing in the world. And then there's the economy. Looking at some major indicators, Biden's unpopularity seemed puzzling at first. After all, his COVID rescue plan offered much-needed relief to over 30 million American families. U.S. GDP is expected to grow between 5 to 6%, the highest since 1976. And Biden had the second-best first-year stock performance in 4 decades. But let's not forget, folks, many of these growth figures came off the relative low base of 2020, where COVID first hit America. Plus, some indicators concerning ordinary American families, such as per capita disposable income, barely grew. What did grow was inflation, which reached 7% in January 2022, the highest America has seen in 40 years. All of this cost Biden in the polls. And now the question is, what will Biden's low popularity mean? According to Gallup, U.S. presidents with approval ratings below 50% have seen their parties lose an average of 37 House seats during the midterm elections. And if that's the case, Biden would lose the House and possibly the Senate too in the upcoming midterm elections, which will worsen Washington's political infighting. Now, under these circumstances, it will be even harder for Biden to course correct when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, he did speak nice words about ending the Saudi war on Yemen, for example, but with little follow-up. He has not rejoined the Iran nuclear deal negotiated by Obama, and his policy towards China looks a lot similar to that of Trump's. After all, foreign policy starts at home, where there's a whole lot of mess to deal with. Now, for more, we're joined in Beijing by Mr. Huang Jing, Dean of the Institute of International and Regional Studies at Beijing Language and Culture University. Mr. Huang Jing, thanks so much for joining us on the Hub on CGTN. Great to have you with us. So, Mr. Huang, a year ago, Joe Biden took office with high hopes that he would be the man, defeating COVID, bringing the U.S. economy back on track, and improve America's standing around the world. But a year later, who would have thought, right? He became the most unpopular president in history, except Trump. What went wrong? Why is his unpopularity? What explains it, rather, at this point?
I think that first, Joe Biden came to office with a very high expectation because lots of voters voted for him, not really because they support him, but because they did not like Donald Trump. So therefore, they hope or they expected Joe Biden to do much better. But right now, the reality is that he's not doing very well. And when Joe Biden came to the White House, he made three promises, basically. Number one, he's going to manage or control the pandemic. Number two, he's going to revitalize the economy. And number three, he's going to heal the nation, the divided nation. But now, all the three problems still exist or even getting worse.
And then, do you think it's Joe Biden's fault, or do you think there are external shocks, so-called external shocks, or things beyond his own control, such as Omicron, Delta, or the ever-evolving international relations landscape, and the Republican Party that is keen on blocking his efforts?
Yeah, I think all those reasons you just listed do exist, but I think the essential reason, the key is that he's facing very strong opposition, Republicans to whatever Joe Biden wants to do in the opposite way. And first and second, because of that, the nation is deeply divided and the politics is polarized. So facing such a situation, whatever Joe Biden tried to do, he has to deal with a kind of force who go exactly against him. As a result, he has not achieved much of the result he desired. I think that the division and the strong opposition are the major reasons for all of this. Of course, another reason is that Joe Biden, his team, his administration itself is not very united as before. This resulted in a very low capability of execution. And the best example, of course, is the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Is a disaster. And other issues, such as his effort try to rally the allies and partners to so-called to make America comes back, does not work very well. And also, I think that Joe Biden sometimes is too ambitious. He has promised too much, but his ability to control his own team, let alone the entire domestic situation, is not as strong as people expected.
And then, how would you say all this would impact the upcoming midterm elections? Because usually, U.S. presidents with approval ratings lower than 50%, they tend to lose seats in the House and the Senate. What will be your predictions?
I think that the Democrats under Joe Biden's leadership will be attacked in all the front, or three front, or four actually. Number one is, of course, pandemic. It's still very, very bad. The pandemic is still raging. Number two is a high inflation, the highest ever since late 1970s. And the economy is really overheated. Number three, of course, is a polarized politics. The society, the whole nation is divided. And last but not the least, in the past year, although Joe Biden made a huge effort, try to rally the allies to make America come back, but still there's not much to sure about. So in all those fronts, he's going to be attacked. Of course, his relationship with China, his policy towards China will also be heavily criticized, already been heavily criticized. In this regard, a lot of people, including myself, we predicted that Democrats are going to lose a majority in both Congress and the Senate. Joe Biden has an uphill battle in the upcoming midterm election, and I do not think that he's going to do very well.
That really leads to my next question, Mr. Huang. if Joe Biden and this Democrats, lose the House and the Senate in the U.S. Congress, will that harden Biden's resolve to do the right thing? For example, to lessen the trade tariffs, to make the relations with China work, or to harden his resolve to get tougher on China because the general election in 2024 is on the line?
I think it will be the latter. That is, if Joe Biden and his Democrats lose majority in Congress, Senate, the only solution for him to keep his government functioning is to appease to the hardliners, that is Republicans. Like you said, he's going to tougher his position vis-a-vis China. His China policy will be even more, aligned to the hardliners approach. Of course, that's not very good news to U.S.-China relationship. Here's the bottom line is that if Joe Biden cannot reach any compromise with Republicans, the only thing that can keep the entire system working to maintain the so-called consensus or grand consensus in U.S. politics is to be tough on China. And as a result, we're going to see a very extraordinary or very unusual phenomena. That is, Joe Biden's administration will become even more hardline against China, but meanwhile, he cannot work out any feasible policies or policy framework to materialize his hardline against China. As a result, it will be more and more difficult to manage the U.S.-China competition. So therefore, I think both leaders, I mean the Chinese leaders and leaders of the United States, have to be very careful not to let this so-called competition slip into what Joe Biden said, unintended conflict.
I mean, what can China do? It looks like China has been willing to work with the U.S. When you think about the fact that it was Trump who started the trade war, and China did counter punches and followed Trump's measures in retaliating U.S. measures. Now, if Joe Biden would be keen on going tough on China, what can Beijing really do to manage the competition?
I think like all the so-called competitors, the first thing China needs to do is to stand firm on China's ground. In other words, the best way to lose a competition, to make both competitors lose, is one side give up. So China cannot give up. China have to stand firm on its ground. In Xi Jinping's own words, China first and foremost has to do its own things well. That's first. The second, of course, China will try everything possible not to follow the U.S. footsteps. In other words, not to dance with a person that is not really rational at the moment. Last but not the least, China has to work with the other members of international community. In other words, with other countries, try to minimize the kind of potential damage done by this U.S., in my view, very irrational and emotional driven policies towards China. In other words, China have to really carry out the multilateralist approach towards the world, towards other major countries. So to work together to minimize the damage. Of course, the Chinese cannot decide what Americans want to do or can do, but Chinese can really, number one, manage its own behavior, number two, to work with others, try to, in U.S. words, to try to put a guardrail on this competition. We know that Ambassador Qin Gang said when he met with Deputy Secretary Sherman after he arrived in the United States, he said, we have tried to, work on a stable, manageable, rational and constructive bilateral relationship. I think that's basically China's approach. That is, try to stand firm to guard China's core interests, and meanwhile, do not dance with Biden administration, which really has a hard time in the internal politics.
Finally, before I let you go, Mr. Huang, I want to ask you about a soft power question. I get asked this question a lot that I want to ask you. And then under these tough and difficult circumstances, what can the Chinese media and its soft power apparatus in general do to really project China's image and to really explain China better to a Western world that is getting increasingly hostile towards China? If you look at polls, the perception of China in Western Europe, in North America, are getting increasingly negative.
I think that that's a good question, very, very timely question. My own view is this: China has achieved a lot, no matter where you look at it, to lift poverty and to develop so fast in the past 40 years without a single gunfire was fired and so on. So China's rise has really been peaceful. But how to tell Chinese story has two approaches. I think one approach is, of course, to tell people how much we have achieved, how great we are, and how strong China is, which is also true. But there's another approach that is to share China's experience with others, with the world. That is, China has achieved so much because the Chinese people has been working very hard, has made a lot of sacrifices, has overcome a lot of challenges, has solved a lot of problems, has dealt with a lot of difficulties. So it's not an easy process. And I think Chinese people or Chinese government should first and foremost tell the outside, tell the world people that how much difficulties, how much we have suffered, how much we have endured to achieve this result. Just like this pandemic, we have to tell the world that the Chinese people really made a lot of sacrifice to share with the world our experience to overcome these difficulties before we tell them our achievement. Do not give people a kind of example where bragging about how good we are. No, we are good because we have worked very hard, extra hard. We have made extra sacrifices to tell people our experience to overcome this difficulty, to tell people how much we have endured. And therefore we can find the kind of common feelings, because nowadays everyone, including Americans, are struggling against the pandemic, against the economy, against a lot of chaotic situations in the world. Then if Chinese can tell them we are suffering, we're enduring the same problems like you guys, or even more, the result, the achievement we can achieve is that because we work together as a Chinese, as a nation, and we endured all of such sufferings, we always look forward to share this experience. I think is a much better approach, right. Just to brag about our achievement to the outside world.
Right, and finally, where do you think the U.S.-China rivalry, competition, however you call it, headed in the medium to a long run? Should we just all be pessimistic about inevitable rivalry, or is there something better to hope for in the medium to long run?
In the medium, I would argue that it might get worse before it gets better, because the uncertainty of U.S. domestic politics. We just discussed that Joe Biden faced a strong opposition. That's a major reason for him to work out a feasible policy framework towards the outside world, especially U.S.-China relations. And this kind of situation will last, especially after midterm election, if Joe Biden does lose the majority support in both House and the Senate, and he's going to have a more difficult time or become a lame duck prematurely. And what makes it worse is that Joe Biden administration might be a one-term, and therefore we're going to have a new president from the Republicans or so on. That will make the situation even more, chaotic. In this kind of situation, I don't expect the U.S.-China relationship getting better. Because one thing we observed in international politics, especially in major power relations, it's one big power. If it has a lot of domestic situations, domestic problems, it tends to lash out, and that's a situation we're going to face in the years to come. But in the long run, I do think that the U.S.-China relationship at least can be manageable. I'm conditionally optimistic for the long term, because first and foremost, U.S.-China cannot overcome each other at all. If there is a result that one side is going to prevail over other side, is because one side made a strategic mistakes, collapse within, just like former Soviet Union. If both countries can do well, eventually China, the Chinese and the Americans, especially Americans, will have to realize the best way is to make a deal, to sit down and negotiate. But that will take some time. Right now, I think this so-called U.S.-China competition is a facade. Beneath this facade is a race between China and the United States to say who can get its own house in order first. Whoever can do the domestic situation well will gain initiatives or even upper hand in this competition. I hope that day will come sooner than later, but in the midterm, it's a tough situation.
Mr. Huang Jing, Dean of the Institute of International and Regional Studies at Beijing Language and Culture University, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your insight. Now, I'm joined by Mr. Adam S. Posen in Washington, D.C. He's the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Sir, it is an honor for us to have you with us at this hour. Welcome to CGTN. Let's talk about the Biden presidency. U.S. President Joe Biden has finished his first year in office amid Omicron. To paraphrase Dickens, we could say this is the best of times and this is the worst of times. Because on the positive side, we look at the economics, the 6.4 jobs have been added in the U.S., consumer demand is strong, wages are up, and the stock market is thriving. If you look at S&P 500 last year, gaining some 20 to 30%, which is very high. But inflation climbed to 7% in 2021, and supply chain challenges are very obvious as we know it. As an economist, would you say the glass is half empty or half full about the U.S. economy?
I'd say it's more than half full right now. The inflation will be dealt with. It needs to be dealt with because it's no longer just about bottlenecks or short supply. When you come back, it's now a more general inflation trend. So it has to be the Federal Reserve tightening policy to deal with it. And I think that makes inflation makes President Biden much more unpopular than he otherwise would be. I think the state of the U.S. economy going forward, like the state of the Chinese economy going forward, is pretty strong and robust. There are inequality issues that have to be taken on, but the broad stability is possible. What is sad in both U.S. and China is that our productivity trends are down. We're not getting as much out of our technology and investment or our workers as we should be. And that's in both sides made worse by the U.S.-China conflict.
Right. Let's talk about inflation. Joe Biden said soaring prices will be a transitory phenomenon brought about by supply chain issues. However, the prices of goods and services in the U.S. have continued to rise at rates unseen in decades. Will we see a tightening of quantitative easing and a rise in interest rates? How should the Fed address this question?
Well, I and some of my Peterson Institute colleagues a year ago were forecasting that inflation would last longer and be higher than either the Fed or Reserve or the Biden administration were saying. We took no pleasure in it, but that was the reality. And so when we look at what's going on now, it isn't just that we had these supply chain issues or people spending so much once they got the economy reopened and the economy couldn't react. Those were indeed transitory, but they take longer, and workers had to readjust. There were pushes for higher wages, pushes for different job conditions, and that takes time. That takes a couple of years to adjust. So nothing's going to make inflation go away overnight, but the Federal Reserve does have to tighten its monetary policy in order to get the general trend down once we're through all these transitory factors. And so that means that they're going to be tightening on the quantity side, and much more importantly, they'll be raising interest rates starting in March or April.
Mr. Posen, you talk about the fact that there needs to be a greater China-U.S. collaboration. But do you think President Joe Biden has the political space to do that? When you think about, the stalled infrastructure plan, thanks to Senator Manchin, the Voting Bill Act, his historically low supporting approval ratings, according to multiple polls, and then the midterm elections coming up later this year. Also, there are politics here in China. I'm not going to lie. So do you think, President Joe Biden and the two sides really have the political space to do the right thing?
I think they have constraints, as you rightly point out, and they are on both sides. There are nationalist or isolationist people worrying about self-reliance, people worrying about an enemy economy in both countries. I think the way forward is twofold. First, the US and China, and I think President Xi and President Biden see this, need to pick a few issues that are either not so sensitive or which people understand are for the good of the world. Obviously, climate change is the biggest one. Making sure that there's good relationships over emergencies and no misunderstandings on military is another one. Economically, we have a successful regime in the central banking exchange rate sphere. The conflicts over yuan dollar that we had a decade ago have largely gone away because of concerted efforts. So I think picking a few areas to work on is the way forward. The second thing is to recognize that trade gets a lot of the political sensitivity, but investment, cross-border, and technological exchange are the bigger, more important things. And we need to work on ways that we can trust each other on investment and technology.
All right, thanks so much for your insight. We have with us Mr. Adam S. Posen, President of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Sir, thank you so much for your insight. Come back again, please.
Thank you for having me on CGTN.
And that will do it for today. If you have any comments or suggestions about our show, feel free to contact me on social media. Thank you for joining us on The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Our news coverage continues